All right, and welcome to the similarities, differences, and lessons learned in enterprise and industrial Wi-Fi networks. That is a mouthful. That is the topic of our webinar series for today, and we have two special guests here that are no stranger to kind of the podcast or webinar world, and that is John Deegan and Landon Foster, and they actually host the Spatial Streams podcast.
I
So
do.
isn't that great?
That's
And
awesome.
yeah. And so just a quick little housekeeping items of just before we get started. I am your host, or sorry, I am your sidekick, Stu Goomans, and I'm joined by my lovely host, Tawny. And as usual, the webinars are always recorded so that if you do have to step off at the end there and go on to do something else, but I'm not sure why you'd always want to stay with us. But we've got those recorded for you. Questions are always welcome in the Q&A panel. The chat window is always open in Ekahau fashion, so you guys can, so everyone can kind of chat and mingle in the room there as well. So with that, I want to actually, you know what, I say this is we can pass it on over to you there, Tawny, for a quick sec. How about that?
Yeah. And just to clarify, it's not industrial versus enterprise we're talking about today. We're just going to talk about some similarities and differences of the two. We've got some experts in the field of both, and so we decided to take it from a different angle and talk about you know protocols are the same, but input stuff is different. So talk about that. But I'm going to turn the time over to them. We'll start with Landon and let you introduce yourself.
Hey, yeah, I'm Landon Foster. Looking at all these locations, I thought I might mention that I'm from Texas. Good to see some of my fellow Yeehaw state dwellers out there. I currently work for TechSynApp. They are a contractor that is involved with a lot of government work, but I've done quite a bit in industrial at this point and a lot of design work.
And John.
I'm John Deegan, currently in New York from Philadelphia, um, wireless architect, and I work in the New York metro area. Um, like Stu mentioned, co-host with Landon of the Spatial Streams podcast, and just really excited to be here.
Well, we're really excited. But before we get into our topic, as you guys know, we like to ask simple questions. So we are curious, has the global pandemic made business decision makers more or less aware of Wi Fi? And by the way, Landon and John, no, sorry, panelists cannot vote.
I see that. I was very disappointed,
Sorry,
actually.
guys.
I've got to cue in
Disenfranchised.
the Jeopardy music just in
Yes. Oh,
case,
yes. I
you know,
forgot. Cue
and
the Jeopardy music.
yes,
Yes.
screw down
All
to a few
right.
more
There we
seconds. That looks
go.
pretty good, eh?
Yeah,
Oh,
that
look at
is.
the votes. Oh, they're coming. Look at that.
All
There we
right.
go.
Here
Perfect.
we go. Now let's look at what folks said. So absolutely, yes. More aware. It's interesting. How important Wi-Fi really, really, truly is, and how different it is how different it looks working from home. But let's go ahead and talk about why we are here today.
Mhm.
So Wi-Fi, same protocol, same standard, right? But the environments are very, very different. So Landon, talk to us about industrial environments and what that looks like, what Wi-Fi looks like in those type of environments.
It looks like a big tangle of metal, is what it looks like. No, industrial environments are just as crowded in some ways as enterprise is, but the environment itself is, I think, the big difference. So you're going to have interspersed areas that are extremely open and just cover a lot of ground, and then you're going to have tight tangles. And I'm speaking mostly from a oil processing and heavy industry sort of experience here. But even if you move into heavy manufacturing, things like that, you're going to have these dense tangles of machinery, pipes, routing, any of your actual process areas are generally going to be pretty dense because the more you spread them out, the more you're going to have to spend to maintain those areas. So it makes coverage very difficult. Um, but then you're going to have storage areas that are pretty wide and actually closer to either warehouse or just open fields.
John, talk to us about enterprise. You have a lot of different kind of environments that you work with.
Well, I mean, it really does depend on what building you're in a given day, right? So, you're talking about typical office space, but nowadays, you could be in an older building, you could be in a newer building. You've got open offices are sort of the or they were the rage prior to COVID. where we were seeing a lot of like agile, more density, packing the people in and, things like that, where we were really starting to make smaller cells. And now we're sort of up in the air. We don't know what it's gonna look like with all the social distancing, but um, you know, you have to know your environment, because you could be dealing with a lot of open space and there's not a lot of material to attenuate. You've got plenty of offices that could have all the pretty architectural design and glass and metal, and no place to put the APs because the architect doesn't want to see the blinky lights. So there's a lot of different things to take into account. And depending on if it's a greenfield build or you're doing a refit, um, there's a lot of different challenges that can come into play, and it does keep things interesting. I know Landon and I have actually talked about the industrial versus enterprise a little bit, and I think we actually touched on it on a podcast as well. But um, my only experience really in any sort of industrial space is just a warehouse, and I don't think a warehouse is even a good something I can lean on compared to, because he's worked on some really interesting, truly industrial areas with some really neat use cases. And I can only imagine dealing with those, because not only are you dealing with RF, but you're dealing with all the different environmental and I guess chemical things that come into play, right? That I don't even have to think about. My major concern is making sure that people like where the Wi-Fi is, it works, and that nobody's going to try and rip my AP off the ceiling because it's bothering them.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about the similarities. So understanding the environment. So Stu,
Mhm.
how are they alike?
Well, a lot of them alike is basically is certain client types. There are a lot that's happening there, and usually have the same workforce going from enterprise into kind of an industrial, because sometimes you've got the enterprise and industrial on the same site, right? So you've got the corporate level walking out of the site building and right into the industrial, like in a mining facility, where you would have corporate offices right there, or enterprise office, and then they need to go in and seamlessly take their devices and move into kind of the plant area, right? And so there is some similarities of that. There's a challenge there of designing for both the devices that need to run on the manufacturing side or industrial side, and the devices that we would normally use on the enterprise side. So there's like a point in place where you'd have those type of devices. So there's some similarities between going through those environments, but there's a lot of differences.
And so Landon, the approach that you take is going to be very similar to what John does. But so talk to us about that, about how you tackle managing, design, troubleshooting. I mean, I know that's a lot, but just talk to us about, in general, how you approach that.
Sure. So I haven't had the dubious luxury of being what most people consider in-house a lot. And I've come to understand that, at least in part, that's fairly usual on the heavy industry, or what I'm referring to as an industrial side, right? So it's a little different. You're not handed a fully formed requirements sheet quite as much as I've experienced when working in more typical enterprise, because you're dealing with a lot of OT people, people who are used to the more specialized things used on that side of the house, let's say. So you're going to have to work with your client a lot, back and forth with those requirements. When they say we want coverage everywhere, your response is not okay. Your response is, okay, well, what constitutes coverage? You got to drill into those use cases and get a better understanding for exactly what they're actually wanting, which, in fairness, may happen in other places. But on the industrial side, you have to be even more sure of that. I think that's actually a factor of cost in a lot of cases, because putting a cable in a plenum ceiling, let's say, an overhead space in an office, is expensive because of contractors and material. But putting a fiber line under a catalytic cracker unit is many, many, many times more expensive. We were looking at a specific case where it was, I believe it was 100 feet of cable. It was going to cost something like $6 million, and that's not counting downtime. So it's just wild, wild. So developing those requirements is one thing I would say is the same, but your intensities are going to be different between the two.
But just understanding the, I mean, you know, those requirements. So there's a lot of the things that are going to be definitely similar in that same process. But,
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. All right. So when we look at this and we look at that industrial enterprise, you know, those differences, we were talking about the similarities, and I kind of jumped ahead a little bit. Sorry there, Tanya, when I was talking about differences, but is we look at, although a lot of those things are the same, those protocols are the same, the, inputs, values are very different, but, what the organization expects is the devices to do dramatically different. The needs of those networks also vary, right? We talked about legacy type devices. Not to go through every little piece here, but I mean, we talk about older scanning guns like Motorola 9090s. Those are very common. There's about 1 billion of those out there, right? And we would hope that one day that we can get around those and move on to the new ones, right? We've got the Zebra type devices. You've got compatibility between there's devices that work well in density and there's others that don't, right? And we're dealing with security issues. We're dealing with older technology. Wouldn't you say we're still dealing with older technology that you guys have seen out there, that there are still things that still require TCAP? I mean, I know we're somewhat beyond that, but there are still things. There's stuff out there that, we're trying to keep networks up for the industrial side. Or, I mean, do you see some things moving along where industrial's changing?
Oh, absolutely. I actually saw part of a project specification a while ago that required us to deprecate web. And you can imagine my shock.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry, you're using what now?
Yeah.
Yeah, they wanted to move up to a WPA scheme. I was like, oh, okay, so we're moving from 20 years ago to 10 years ago. Good to go. But you're right. Yeah, there's lots of legacy stuff out there, and I mean, that can be sensors. Zebras really common. I've run into zebras not only in, I guess, my last role, but the one before that. There's some oddball devices out there that aren't legacy but behave like it too, which is something you need to be aware of. I would advise trying to pull the FCC documents for whatever you can, and trying to get spec sheets for whatever you can, no matter what you're in.
And I guess, wouldn't you say, and I want your thoughts too, John, on that one, but wouldn't you say that, we also have to kind of always research the driver? When was the last driver published for a lot of these devices? I know I've come across that. How about yourself there, John?
There's a lot of different factors that come into play. I'm fortunate, I think, in the sense of what I do, where I do it. We don't have a ton of legacy devices, not necessarily the same. I think it's a little bit different enterprise versus industrial, because we have a lot of end users that are looking to always be on the latest and greatest. Whereas, Landon mentioned that the really expensive cable job, when you're dealing with an industrial area like that, they're looking to put something out there once every 10 or 15 years and get the most out of it. And when you're talking about downtime in a warehouse or a factory or something like that, there really is a very significant quantifiable cost. So I think you're more likely to see a lot more legacy devices in those places than enterprise. Not that they don't exist. We do have a few of them. I've seen a couple scanners. I'm lucky that most of the scanners we're starting to use are actually able to support 5 gigahertz, and actually some of them even are capable of MDM, which is great for us. So we can sort of nip the security part too. But absolutely, I mean, I've one of the things when they're bringing a new device is I always like to ask them for a tester, because while I can trust what they're telling me or about the device, I want to get my hands on it because I want to make sure I understand what it's doing or how it's failing. And just, like Landon said, read the documents, read the spec sheets, know the device. And one of the things that we've had to do over the course of time is get in front of the customer before they order it. And I've heard it so many times from so many other people that they've gone out and their customer has bought 100 or 1,000 or whatever, some crazy odd number of these devices. And they come to them and say, okay, well, you've got to make this work on the wireless network. And then you give them an answer that they don't like, and they're like, well, I already bought them, so we have to make them work.
I've experienced that many times in my career, but I'm starting to see a light at the end of the tunnel when you've got a good project manager on it now. So if you've got a good PM, work closely with the PM on your project, because that way you can go and say, hey, by the way, what is this device that you guys are planning to implement? What are we designing this network for? And if you can get ahead of that, and the cart before the horse, right? And you can hit the frame on the head, right? So if you want to say, look, that device there, I know it's been on the market for about 10 years. Well, the last time it was drivers was updated, it was about 7 years ago. Maybe this is going to work. Maybe this is not. We've got some new protocols. Maybe it doesn't support roaming. That's something that we need. Is this a mission critical device? So always ask those. And then you come into the bigger ones that are, which is into the industrial. And I think it's going to be a little bit in a use cases a little later. I think, because Tony and I were talking about is we have is types of the devices. Some of them are like, I think there's my buddy Jason Bashara has often mentioned this, is if you need, sometimes you have a device, it has a certain IP level rating. I think it was a hazardous type rating, where that is in a secure box, and it's got to have Wi-Fi to get out of it, but it's in that box because it's in an oil and gas facility, right? So you can't be in a thank you very much, division one, class 1, division 1 and 2. Thank you very much, Mr. Bachara. X and Stephen Rodriguez, perfect. Yes. Because I don't know, have you had experience with that, trying to design a network for those type of devices?
Yeah, absolutely.
Complicated, right? I mean,
we're lucky that we have a lot of vendors that are tending to that, because it used to be an incredibly niche space where you were just out of luck. Not that you couldn't put it out there, but you'd have one or two choices for AP. Cisco threw out the IW6300, and there's a lot of places that's their only option. They don't know about the other options. So that's two things with that I'd say you have to consider. You do have the ready-mades, which are the 1552 series, which is mostly being deprecated now for the IW6300, which are class 1 div 2. Class 1 div 1 gets really dicey, because it involves vacuum sealing, and anytime it's opened, it's recertified, and it's a mess. But the important thing is to realize that there are casings that you can at least get made. There's a lot of ready-made ones for the AP you want to use and for the vendor you want to use. So I'd suggest introducing a little flexibility into your assessment and purchasing for that. Just because you don't want to get stuck with one vendor and even more locked in than you already are, just based on that. If you have an opportunity to change vendors that fits your organization better, which is what you should be looking at, what's best for my organization, not what makes necessarily, your PM or purchasing happier. So consider those options, and you need to make sure to be very thorough in that research, though. There's people who, I'll just leave it there, actually. Make sure that they are certified class 1, div 1 or div 2.
Right. Yes. Otherwise you get yourself in trouble later on. Right. So, but that is complicated for sure. John, did you have any thoughts on that one?
No, I mean, I think that hit on it, and actually I wanted to comment. Keith posted a comment about it too, and it was something that we've gone through as well, where you have to get in front of the purchasing and say that, Keith's comment was about the Chromebooks that his school customers buy. And we've seen it with just enterprise laptops in general. And actually, I was in a class with Chris Avance, and he said the same thing, that you need to make sure you get in front of not just purchasing your APs and the scanners and things, but even like your laptops, right? You can get the very basic laptop and pay for the basic laptop Wi-Fi card, and you get what you pay for. And purchasing sees it as saving, $5, $7, $10, whatever the cost is per laptop. And yeah, sure, over, if you're buying 10, 20,000 laptops, it does add up. But how much of that savings is going to get eaten into because the laptops don't perform as well, they don't last as long, there's driver issues, whatever the case may be, you need to know what you're buying. And it seems sort of counterintuitive, maybe not necessarily where the webinar was thinking about going, but it's important for us as professionals to make sure that we get in front of the right people before, if ever possible, before the things have been purchased. Because otherwise, there we can drive the design discussion a little bit better, as opposed to designing with a very limited set of, you can't do this, or this, because we've already bought that, so you have to design for this. Whereas if we get in front of them, at step 1 instead of step 7, we have the ability to sort of not drive the narrative, but work with them and say, well, why do you want to buy this? Okay, well, if we buy this, we can't do this, this, or this. But if we buy that instead, then you're opening up a whole different, set of design options to consider it. And so it's just something else to keep in mind.
And John, I was just going to say really quickly, I'm glad you said that, because that's one of the things that we wanted to make sure we highlight is trust your experience and your expertise to be able to make those recommendations to folks. The purchasing department is looking at the cost savings per, but what happens with longevity? What happens over the course of time, replacement, performance? What is the application that they're needed for? What do these devices need to do on the network? What additional network equipment do we need to buy in order to get those to be able to work? And so trusting that expertise is really, really important of yourself. Stu, you were going to.
Yeah, I was just going to say is that, it's like you talk about those devices between the enterprise and industrial is that, the industrial devices usually cost a little bit more, and there's a reason for that, right? That it needs to take abuse and into the environments that it's in, whether it's in a environment where there's a lot of salt content, like in a salt mine or a potash mine, which I've had the experience of actually going to go inside one and seeing how devices react there, right? Very different. You think, no, it should be fine, but you need devices that are actually meant for the job, right? And so, yes, it does cost a little bit more, but it's going to last you a little longer. Yes, the lifetime is going to last longer. And I think that's where the companies need to understand is, okay, so if I buy this, my ROI is going to be better. Yes, right? And there's a reason why that is.
So I got to jump in and say one thing I think that gets mentioned in some circles but doesn't have as much penetration into ours is don't be afraid to make it someone else's idea. I'm very much of the conviction that our job is to make things work, not necessarily to get the VP high five. And sometimes when you're doing these designs, you may need to make it the PM's idea. I'm not saying lie. I'm saying if you present it, in an oblique way to your PM and they go, oh, well, what about this thing on that page you sent me? Sometimes you need to let other people succeed in a visible way so that you can accomplish your aims.
And that kind of goes to reading the room, though. I think to an extent, you have to understand. I mean, it's what I teach my kids all the time. You have to know who to ask and how to ask it, right? You lay out a couple different solutions. You might sit there and say, I prefer or suggest version A versus version B. But, especially, and I think it depends on the approach, right? I'm in a position where I'm an internal, sort of support group for my company, whereas Landon, you're coming in as you're paid to do a job. And so I think there's different views, but I've worked, you have to make them allies, right? You have to get them to buy in. And if they think, hey, look, this makes sense. I like this better than that. And that was what we wanted, but I see the point here. You get them to buy in a little bit and it makes it really good, but you have to be careful not to sell anything that is too new to really worry about. We've had that a couple times where customer caught wind of, or we mentioned something new coming down the pike and they were like, well, let's wait until that comes out. And like, well, that's not coming out for like 18 months and you needed to refresh 2 years ago. So let's not wait.
For sure. I think that's one of the lessons learned, whether we're in the industrial or the enterprise environment, work with your PM. There's one of our guests on the webinar here, Michael says, guide your PM to your solution. That is so true, because you want to be able to, that when you're planning that solution of where those APs are going to be placed in your design, whether it's in the educational, in enterprise, industrial, healthcare, you need to see, okay, this is the access point that we're putting in. This is why we're putting it in. And then, and this is the budget that we need to do this and to make it right. Because we want a successful project. Working with a PM is going to be your best friend. Their PM is going to sell it upstream, right? He's going to make sure that, okay, this is how it's going to work. Because at the end of the day, the buck's going to stop with you as the person who's actually putting that Wi-Fi together, right? You want to make sure that I'm going to walk away from that from a design that works.
Yeah,
right.
100%.
So, Landon, talk to us some about the lessons learned in industrial and some of the things that you can help. Because I think, we talk a lot about design, but the reality is working with your PM is not just a design function. Because when you are troubleshooting and when you're managing your network and you're looking at what you need to do to change future growth, or even, you all of a sudden have an explosion of devices on your network, things have to change. And so it's at every phase and that constant working relationship that really helps make sure that the network is performing the way it needs to.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. So you do have to think about that longer lifestyle, or excuse me, life cycle generally in industrial. Because of the expense, you want to look at what it's going to look like in 3 years, 5 years. They may tell you that we have a refresh cycle of 3 years, but you have to consider when that starts and when it's going to get around to it. Is that the refresh starts in 3 years and you go plant by plant over a project that covers 5 years? And you can't just look at what you're putting in either. Is this going to be end of life in 4 years, and what's my risk factor involved in that? But with that, you have to pay attention to the legacy devices too. You're going to have people who are crowing for you to put in AX, AD, all the new fancy bells and whistles because we've got the money now. And sometimes that'll be appropriate. But you have to consider how that is going to work moving forward, right? Is the gain you're going to get from a relatively newly released AXAP in a box better than the proven one that's going to be end of life in 4 years, but it works with everything you have? Are you willing to take the chance or do the legwork to get a test case for that? Now, I would always advise, like John said, being able to test these things. If you can get an advanced release to put in your lab and then go grab, some of those scanners or communicators or alarms and seeing how they perform, do it. And I would urge you to be very, very diligent about how these things work in your lab. You're working at an economy of scale in industrial generally. When you get a sign off on this project, there's a lot of inertia there trying to get into the project, but once it starts rolling, the inertia is very much moving forward. So be careful and do your due diligence for that. Um, I would also say, kind of like we have noted here, if you're in a industrial space, whether that be heavy, light, and anything in between, you do need to start considering IoT. Very much in the spectral side. I'm always a fan of moving what you can into 5 gig, which will save you from a lot of the depredations of IoT, because most of them are still using the cheaper 2.4 chips, or communicating on things like alternate PHYs. Let's just say that, a lot of which for us will live in the 2.4 spectrum. But you need to build those into your designs and understand how that's going to affect. Luckily, Ekahau has some things we can show you that involve that, but very much consider it. And the other thing we have listed here that I definitely wanted to cover, I was actually talking with Stu and Tawny about it, is that turning up your power, just like an enterprise, to increase your quote unquote coverage is not always the solution. You're going to run into an empty parking lot every now and then, where having a higher power AP, higher, not highest, mind you, is going to be effective. But then you're going to run into things like, say, a forklift zooming over a large area that has some data it needs to transmit on the move, that you're going to want it to be able to roam instead of, taking a shot in the dark, getting that data back to that AP. If it's got an SNR of 5 and it'll work on an SNR of 4 at the edge of your cell, is that a chance that you can take with that data? Those are things you got to think about it, and ideally you got to lab it up.
Absolutely. So, John, talk to us about things in enterprise, that lessons learned along the way, and things that are need to make sure that you consider as part of your managing your network.
I mean, I think the biggest thing, and I saw somebody else touched on it in the chat, was you get your stakeholders involved, and you need to know who you're dealing with and what you're dealing with, right? It's very easy for somebody to sit there in the boardroom and say, I want every AP to be Wi-Fi 6. I want full coverage everywhere, and just make it work. And we hear it all the time. Customers can sometimes be just, just make it work. It's simple. Wi-Fi is simple. It's like at home. But the reality is, in any environment, whether it's industrial or enterprise or anything in between, even in that same building, while it might be one customer, you've got a subset of customers. If you're dealing with a school, you're going to have, the biology lab is going to have different requirements and use cases than the theater arts program. In a corporate office, you're going to have boardrooms and conference rooms that are going to be different than your bullpen for your sales team. So you need to understand all of the different requirements that you're dealing with, and just work with those. Find out, like, sure, fine, not to pick on any user group, but the general user population of an office may not be that big of a concern. As long as it works, you can pretty much design for the cubicle farms and whatnot. But you can ask the customer, what areas are your biggest pain points right now? What do I have to make sure works when we deliver this? And sort of keep that in mind. We've always got, like, okay, this group has a voice application. They need to make sure it roams really well around this particular area of the floor. Or, this is the executive section of the floor. We can't have any drops, but they don't want to see the APs either. But make sure you document what those requirements are and design to it. If you have carte blanche and you can just say, I want to deliver the most coverage, the best coverage with the newest APs, then that's great. But the other thing too is, especially, like I said, as somebody servicing an internal customer, we've gotten much more in tune now than we were when I started with the life cycles lining up. I remember when I started, AC was just coming out, and I had some folks that were on the Apple side saying, like, why don't we have any wireless, AC capable devices? Because I've got an AC capable iPhone or Mac or whatever you had, and I want to be able to use it. I'm like, well, we don't have any corporately provided devices that are offering that. And customers are going to deal with that now. Why don't we have AX? Why don't we have Wi-Fi 6? Well, do you have a Wi-Fi 6 capable device in your hands? Do you have that density in your devices in your user population? And chances are the answer is no. So you don't have to drop what you're doing now and buy the latest APs, because you can line it up with your other equipment refresh. So there's a lot of different things coming into play, that if you're just looking at it from a Wi-Fi perspective, you don't care, but you have to. You really should care, and you can use that. I'm fortunate enough to be able to work with those, the people that buy the hardware for the end users, that we can sit there and say, okay, well, buy this chipset, not that, and you're refreshing every 5 years, so we can refresh every 5 years, and so we can sort of be in lockstep. But it's important to have the conversations, and I've learned it over the years, just in tech in general. If you come in and you have a conversation with your customer or your end user, and you make it more collaborative, where they actually have input, however much you're actually taking into account or not is irrelevant. But if you make them feel like they're a part of the process and you make it that collaborative effort, you increase the chances of buy-in. You increase the odds that your users are going to be satisfied with what you're deploying, because you're going to know what they need, and you're going to be that much more in tune with it, and you're going to take that into account.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that has stuck with me is when, you were talking about talking to the user groups and understanding the applications and how those devices are going to be used. I hear a thought in a story that I heard. An individual was designing for a network, and they were told they had 200 Cisco phones that they were going to be utilizing in the call center, right? But the reality was those 200 phones were not all ringing at the same time. So the design was built for 200, when in reality, only 50% of those would be utilized at any given time, right? So it's really understanding the devices and the user groups and how they're using those, using the network time on there. But before we're going to talk about some use cases here, and we have some really cool things that we're going to show you guys. But before we do that, we have another poll question. And so this one, we do. And so, which industries do you see having the biggest growth in Wi-Fi projects in 2021?
Ooh, I want to answer.
This one, you can choose more than one answer.
But Tawny, I want to answer.
You can't answer, Stu.
I've been told I'm not allowed to, so
Actually, it won't let me answer. Just for you folks out there, it won't let me. It's amazing how fast the votes are coming in, and you can see the percentages changing. It's really slick. You folks can't see it, but It looks pretty slick out our
Yeah,
side.
we'll this one I know is a little more thought provoking, so we'll give a little more time on this one.
So that means double jeopardy.
That is slightly extended.
All right. We'll go ahead and end that. Sorry, folks, if you didn't get to finish. But let's look at that. What everybody thinks. Healthcare. Biggest changes coming in healthcare.
Wow.
Yeah. Healthcare
That's a lot more
and
spread out.
education. So awesome.
And just to know there, there was quite a number of people that didn't get to answer that question there. So
Yeah.
it just shows the number low. There was coming up, but we usually can't stay on the poll question too long.
All right. Well, let's talk about some of the use cases. So Landon, let's talk about some specific industrial things that you've done over the course of time. Let's talk about that and some of the things that you run into.
Sure. Yeah, actually, before we start digging in on this one, I have one that was brought up earlier that I remembered. It's fine. That screen's great. It was with the IW6300. So I did use Ekahau to solve this one. We had just put out the APs, and it has two different modes, kind of poorly named, but dual mode and single mode, where you can use all four antenna ports, or you can just use two of the antenna ports for kind of dual band driven by one pair of antennas. So we were set up for using all four of the antenna ports. So you have the two on the inside dedicated to 5 gig and the two on the outside on 2.4. And what was interesting is we had fantastic SNR, like 20 or 30 dB SNR, fantastic SNR. But our throughput was terrible. And we had just more retransmissions than we had any right to, with having such good SNR. So it was interesting seeing these both on the map at the same time, especially putting active survey data in it, which I usually don't unless we're diving after a specific problem like this. What we eventually figured out is it was not doing what it told us in the UI, whether you're doing it from CLI or the GUI. So it was trying to do dual band on an antenna that was only rated for 2.4. So our SNR was in fact good, but we had such a big VSWR in the antenna itself that it was turning the RF into garbage as soon as it was coming out. So we could tell there was a signal, but we couldn't tell what that signal was, which is interesting because it wasn't noise. It was still identifiable as 802.11. So
it's almost like it's speaking another language.
More or less.
Yeah.
Tower of Babel in those APs, I tell you.
That's right. Yeah. You didn't have your universal translator on at the time.
I didn't, although I have wanted to use those Babel earpiece things. All right. Can we have that slide?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. So let's talk about some of the things you see when you're managing your network. So obviously in a scenario like this, the design is already done. You've done some survey to capture the data. So let's talk about some of the things that you can see and how that's helpful.
Yeah, so one of my favorites that was actually have no track of time, so I think it's still fairly new, is the ability to have your spec in on the sidekick, not sidewalk. Please don't put your spec in on the sidewalk. To have your spec in sort of charted along a time axis and then plotted along with your survey. Because I can look back in time and actually see what the spec in was seeing in any given time, which extending that any given place, since we're generating those data points on the map. So if you're trying to troubleshoot and you're seeing something really strange on your spec in, this is the perfect place to find it, because you're no longer looking at like a FFT or anything else that has no other connecting data, right? Being able to say, oh, well, at the bottom left corner of a warehouse, we got a really weird spike. I think it's actually one of my favorite use cases for this in particular. It lets you track them down instead of playing, what's the game with the hammers and the rodents?
Whack-a-mole, I think.
Whack-a-mole. Yeah.
There you go.
I say pop goes the weasel, but no, that is a children's song. That is, in fact, not an arcade game. We do not endorse violence of any kind, by the way. But yeah, I think that saves a lot of time. If you're rogue hunting, you can also use it for that. Although in most environments I've been in, you're going to be out there a while just because the sheer volume of them. But pay attention to that. I would actually suggest once you finish your survey to look back through your spec am and try to identify any anomalies you can before they bite you on the other end, and ideally before you leave site if you don't work at the place you're surveying, right?
So let's say you're in an environment, you did your survey, you're looking, you did a packet capture and now you're analyzing it and kind of looking at it. How do you notice that you have a lot of retries, retransmitted packets. How do you reduce that? How would you go about reducing that?
Well, I mean, you're going to have to work backwards. So my first question for a bunch of retries is, what's our SNR? What's our RSSI? Ideally, we could get that from the client, though that's harder. But that's the first thing. Go to the physical layer, see if you're actually receiving the RF well. If you're receiving the RF well, you're going to have to dig into it a lot more, right? And it opens up significantly after that. How are you getting the packet capture would be the first thing that I would have to ask. Because if in the packets, if you're capturing client side, you can see not quite what the client sees, but a much closer approximation than if you saw it off of the controller or a survey.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right, John. So talk to us about some enterprise use cases, studies, things that you have found that are quite interesting.
I mean, for me, we're using, the Sidekick in particular, trying to think of some good examples or use cases, especially because it's been so long since I've been in the office. I think one of my favorite use cases was, honestly, we got into the habit of walking our buildings on a regular basis just to make sure that everything was still functioning the way we had designed it, sort of that audit. And like Landon mentioned about rogue hunting, not that I necessarily could or did do a lot of rogue hunting, but we had a lot of areas that were very, very particular about Wi-Fi performance and got a lot of attention, and got into a few different issues that we were troubleshooting over the course of time, where we would use, we would often walk, a couple floors. I was walking a couple times a week, to be honest, because it was right there, just to see, because people were turning on hotspots that they said they weren't turning on, or they had a home router that they were running that they were just turning off when we walked around and things like that. But using it to troubleshoot and tune was probably the biggest use case for me. Being able to, and just in general with spec end, being able to graphically show someone, like, this is what it looks like when it's good, and see that red's bad, and we're seeing it here and it's coming from that device, and being able to sort of visually represent the problems that they're experiencing so they can understand, and then turning around and saying, okay, well, if you don't believe me, turn it off and I'll show you the spectrum go get clean, and your performance with the other stuff should, sort of line up and be better. So we used it a lot for that. I think that's probably the biggest item that I've used it for. I'm trying to think of anything else that's I'm trying to think of anything else that's good. That's my favorite use case, I think, for the Sidekick, just the auditing and the tuning and things like that. Especially since we've got it, I'm a big fan of just strapping it on, plugging it in, and walking the space. Before we got the gear, it was one of those where we weren't using the right tools. We didn't have a lot of tools to choose from, and it was sort of I don't want to say it was a guessing game, but you lacked the actual empirical knowledge or the evidence to say, look, this is what's wrong, or this is what's right with the space. And so to be able to walk through and say, okay, the power levels are off, or, hey, look, all of my APs are scanning at the same, they're all on the same channel for whatever reason. We forgot to check a box, or somebody forgot to check a box. And so let's get that right. And then all of a sudden, a couple minutes later, and the whole site is a lot happier, because, you have, 20 APs aren't on the same channel anymore. It's very, very a powerful tool to be able to see your space in those kinds of ways.
And I think that that's really good, because, having the right tools and the tool sets to understand what's happening is important. And I think we're finally out of the days of the old Wild West days of Wi-Fi. When you say, I mean, it's we used to do we'll hang the AP up or mount the AP up and hope that it works. And we think that's going to work in that area. but I mean, having the actual design tools to understand how it's going to be placed, and then also understanding and reading the data, what is that, how's that AP performing? What does the RF look like, right? How can we make sure that so that we don't get client drops, right? Because that's going to be the thing. You could be in education and healthcare, and clients are dropping constantly. Well, why are they dropping? What's the problem? And then using tools.
It's a good thing you asked that, Stu, because someone asked the question. They were having dropouts every 30 seconds if they have more than 600 clients on the network. What could possibly cause that?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And I was reading that question too, and that's why I was kind of trying to drive it in here. And it's, and what could possibly cause that? Well, there's a number of things that could be happening on that one. We could have, if we're seeing dropouts like that, we're going to have items like, it depends. It's going to be the first one. And the second thing is, are like we said, are the APs, are they all on the same channel? Are we having a lot of contention? Are we having a lot of co-channel interference? Are we seeing improper roam handoffs? Or are we having bottlenecks with DNS? Like, are we having DNS issues? Are we having just that, are there clients dropping off because there's a firmware issue on the APs, or software issue on the controller, or whatever that might be? It could be a number of things. So you want to kind of drive down and figure out first, are we having problems with the RF? Do we need to actually do a walkthrough, an assessment to say, okay, what is the sidekick, insert sidekick here? What does it see? Do we see some interference? Is it a microwave transmission from a microwave? Is it caused a certain time of day? Why is the client dropping? Are they all dropping at once?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, Stu.
Right.
Let's take a look.
Ooh,
Killer
you've got a clip. That's great.
It's funny. And so that's the thing. I think that even though our environments can be different, there are some common interferences that can wreak havoc on your network across. It doesn't matter what environment you're in, it can still cause the same problem. So let's take a look at what this particular environment, what the RF was doing and how it was behaving in this one. So Stu, talk to us.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're doing is we're seeing regular office space, coffee break time. And what's in those rooms? A microwave. This is a perfect example here of how the sidekick's actually seeing a Panasonic microwave. Your regular kitchen microwave, you assume that it should be shielded enough, but a lot of times this is what you're going to see. And as you can see how the channel utilization just spikes right up to that almost that 100%. It's literally obliterating those channels. So those APs that you saw there, they were there before. Now they're trying to come back. Now you can see APs 11 is coming back and it's working. But once that microwave kicks in place, it's gone. And you could be in an environment where the device you have is 2.4 only. There are devices out there that just do 2.4, right? And that could be a shop foreman coming in on the industrial side, coming into the coffee room. Yep, I got my device, no problem. Why isn't this thing working?
Yep.
Oh, it's working. I finished my.
And that's one of the things
my lunch.
Too, that Landon was highlighting, the IoT devices and utilizing 2.4 and some of that.
Yeah, because that's going to be an effect, right? Is how do you have an AP that is going to be able to defend itself and switch channels fast enough, and to get around that? Or maybe you've got a microwave that's got some. I know, Landon, we were talking about this at the beginning, that sometimes some microwaves, maybe time to upgrade them. Maybe there's a leak.
Yep. Yeah, right? Absolutely. I think it's also important when you're looking at particularly spec-in shots like this too, that you can communicate effectively the difference between a narrowband interferer, a wideband interferer, and an all-band interferer, right? Because if you tell someone, if you're like, say you're a junior engineer reporting to your senior, and you say it's blocking out the entire 2.4 band, and you're just seeing it, say, centered on channel 11, kind of like if we extended what we're seeing now on the screen, that's an entirely different animal than what we saw from the microwave.
I'm glad you said that, Landon. Let's look at what could cause some wideband interference. That it's not blocking the entire channel. But so what are some of the type of things that can cause that wideband interference in an industrial environment?
So you kind of have to remember a maxim, of the engineering side. If it's moving and it's electrical, it generates RF. That doesn't mean that it's intentionally generating RF. Your intentional radiators are something different, but everything that moves. So let's say you have a large electric motor, or even something as small as a diesel starter. They're all going to generate some sort of interference. What you're seeing here, I think, is probably a motor, some sort of motor. And there's a lot of fun math you can get into for it. But what you need to know on the operational side is if you're going to be placing an AP or a sensor next to a large consumer or generator of power, especially one that involves motion, it's going to generate some interference. The question is if that interference is going to be in the spectrum you're trying to use or not. And then also, if it's unavoidable, how much airtime is it taking up? Is it all the time? Just absolutely continual? Does it activate at certain times of the day? And how high is the amplitude? Because if you have an interferer that's, let's say, all band at neg 90 all the time, but it's non-802.11, I bet there's some configuration you can do to help you out with that. Is it going to raise your noise floor? Yes. But if you can get it treated as just noise instead of trying to transmit through it, that may be your best case sometimes.
Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes you hit it there as well, is seeing signals like that. I've seen DC motors actually have in compressors, like industrial compressors, have that field that shows up every once in a while, and you're like, what the heck is that? And it's usually something with the magnetos off or something that's gone on it, and it's just creating this environment. It's really hard to track down and kind of, well, how do you fix that, right? Is to identify, do you have to live with it, so to speak?
Yeah. So Stu, talk to us about the identification of what some of these, or classification of what some of these interferences are.
Yeah. So we've got classifications on in here where we can actually, if we're seeing something spike up, like a video camera or a generic frequency hopping device, and that's something definitely that we do in this particular now. Identifying the actual pieces, it is not easy. It's because everything's different and things are kind of a moving target these days. So trying to get that exact piece there. But in here, what we're doing is, and I think what you see on the time scale is over on the other side there, you can see down at the bottom there at 0800 there, you'll see that spike that comes up there. That's actually from a video camera. So that kind of spike there is classified. I'm sorry for that. This video didn't go back in time there enough there, but that is a video camera spike, and that's actually created right at the from that particular device. So it was a video camera that was going on. It was one of those wireless, those people put them on the outside of houses, whatever, little spy cams, right? And that's where that spike was coming up there. And then the next one down along the bottom there, that the super long one across the spectrum there, that was a generic frequency hopping device that was classified in there. And those things actually get marked on your survey file, right? So when you're actually going out to your survey or assessment, you will actually see that type of interference classifications.
So, John, I have to ask, have you seen any non-802.11 stuff like cameras in your environment? I know I caught them occasionally in mine.
I've seen a few. Fortunately, most of ours are hardwired. Most of the interferers we see we get a lot of people playing around with streaming devices and things like that. So we'll see, the random goofy wireless toys and things like that. It sounds crazy, but we've got a lot of people that tinker with things like that. I know, going back a little bit, the microwave example was actually a good one. One of the first chances we had with the SpecAn, when we got the tools, we had a user that was streaming. Their office was right next to the cafeteria, and they were using, I think, a Roku or a Chromecast or something like that. And they swore up and down it was one of the nicer ones, that it was, the device was fine, everything works great at home. And we went over to look at it, and we're like, okay, well, there's a lot of 2.4 here in general, and it's really, really bad. And then they're like, well, and it really gets bad from like 12 to 2 every day. And then we looked a little bit more, and we realized that the model they bought was 2.4 only. And we're like, I hate to tell you to buy a new device, but if you spend $100 and buy the 5 gig capable unit, this problem is going to go away, or at least it's going to get less. So it's always important to see what's there, because there are plenty of offices, I'm sure we've all worked in, where as bad as we say 2.4 is, you go in the right spot, and 2.4 is not bad. And at the end of the day, I know there are several people in the chat that are going to say, any spectrum is good spectrum. So don't throw away 3 usable channels just because we all want to rag on 2.4. But there, I mean, you can go to a warehouse in the middle of an empty field and 2.4 is going to be fine.
Yeah, and I think too one of the best ways, folks are asking some questions about it. One of the best ways to find the interference is walk the environment.
Absolutely.
Fire up your sidekick, capture the data, look, see where you're seeing the spikes, look at what's happening in the RTFM, see what's causing it, and kind of look around. I think, Stu, you had a great story that you share, and I know we've shared it before, but talking about the television that was broadcasting the SSID. In order to find that, you actually have to be in the environment, and you have to not just look at what the RF is doing and see that feedback that's coming back, that data that's coming back to you, but you also have to actually look at the environment. What devices are there? What's happening? What are you seeing that could cause that? Like you were talking about wireless cameras. A lot of people have those and it causes the spikes. And that's what you can see is some interferences, or there might be something else, like that TV that was broadcasting its own SSID in that regard.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the TV was like, the TV was only on when the boss was in the office.
Yeah.
Right. And so then, hey, that's when it's going to kick in.
Right.
And that doesn't stop there. We even got in the chat there, HP printers. That is the most common one. I've even seen the Wi-Fi come back on after a firmware update.
Yep.
So maybe you might have disabled it and all of a sudden it comes back on. And
another common one too, and I'm sure people can relate to this, but cable boxes, right? That you get the all-in-one wireless
yes.
and
yeah,
all the different providers. They don't care about being, good neighbors. They're going to put it out there at 80 megahertz wide channels because they want the best performance. So 80 is better than 20 in their minds.
And you see this in enterprise because enterprise will buy, we'll get the, from the telco, and the telco's like, yeah, we'll just put one of our standard boxes in and you give you the, you got 200 megabit service or whatever. And that's fine. But unbeknownst to you, the standard, telco's SSID is broadcasting on it, and it's handing out, and it's got, well, that's a security concern. But not only that, it's killing your environment. Like you said, 80 megahertz wide is the default, right? And that may be
the flip side of it too is I think a lot of people don't realize you can actually get, and I can't speak for all the carriers, but some of them will give you a box that doesn't have the Wi-Fi built into it.
Right. Or you got to sign into it and then turn it off, right?
Well, that's the thing too, right? So now the boxes are getting harder and harder to do anything with, right? So I literally at home, I went from Spectrum to Verizon, and I'm not trying to vouch for any vendor, but both of the vendor provided equipment, the new gear, you can't do anything. Like I went into my Spectrum box and I couldn't turn off my Wi-Fi. Like the only way I can turn it off is by putting out my own hardware. So you got to look at that as you go to an office and they're using the TV service, but they just got that because it was package deal. You might not be able to turn that off at this point. The newer routers are coming where it's all through a GUI, web page only, and very little. Like I couldn't even change the password in the one box. And I was like, yeah, well, that's never going to get on my network anymore. So it's there, but and to their point, they're trying to be more customer friendly, and they're marketing towards an audience that isn't pretty much anybody on this call, where they don't want to, or they can't, or they're not, whatever, they think their customers aren't smart enough to do it. They're marketing for that, like just make it easy, plug it in and it works. I need my nerd knobs. So
exactly.
All right, folks. Well, we are at the top of the hour here.
Yes.
So thank you, John and Landon, for joining us. And if you had any questions and you're not sure, one of the great things that you can do is join one of the ECSE classes. We have a great training program here at Ekahau from ECSE Design, Advanced and Troubleshooting, to help you be able to identify these interferers, to help you troubleshoot your networks, to be able to design a network that's reliable, that help you mitigate risk and minimize interferences that you're going to have. Landon and John, if you guys have any questions, I know there were questions we didn't quite get to, but both John and Landon are available on Twitter and more than happy to answer any questions that you have. So thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. A lot of great content, and so we'll just we'll close out. But if on the webinar here, so I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I'm your sidekick Stu, and my host.
Oh, I'm Tawny, but he's a co-host. So
Thank you very much. And
All right.
we will close out on stop the recording.
All right, folks.